From that night on, no one dared place another scarecrow in the fields. They worked under the sun's watchful gaze, always glancing over their shoulders at dusk. And though old Rue was gone, the villagers swore they could still feel its shadow lingering just beyond the edges of the light. When the fire died down, the shadow was gone. The fields lay silent, the oppressive weight lifted, but the villagers knew better than to celebrate. The curse might have been broken, but the scars remained, a warning etched into the soul of Evermere. Flames engulfed old Rue, and a deafening wail filled the air, a sound so unearthly it made their blood run cold. The shadow writhed violently, shrinking and twisting as the scarecrow burned. The villagers watched, frozen in terror, as the flames consumed the figure entirely. When they reached the scarecrow, Clara stepped forward. Her hands shook as she raised the torch, the flames illuminating the stitched grin of the burlap face. The shadow lashed out, dark tendrils wrapping around her ankles, pulling her back. She screamed, but the others acted quickly, hacking at the shadow with scythes and knives. The darkness recoiled, and Clara thrust the torch into the scarecrow's chest. Under the cover of the moonless night, a small group of villagers approached the fields, torches in hand. The air was thick and cold, their breaths visible as they moved. Old Rue loomed ahead, its shadow writhing and twisting as if aware of their intentions. A murmur spread through the crowd, a mix of hope and skepticism. "And if it doesn't work?" someone called out. Clara had no answer, but the growing darkness around them left little room for doubt. They had to act. Clara, standing near her mother, hesitated before speaking. Maybe it's not about what we give. Maybe it's about what we take back." The crowd turned to her, confusion and desperation in their eyes. "The shadow is alive because of the scarecrow," she said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "If we destroy it completely, burn it, maybe the curse will end." "And what would you suggest?" Dorian snapped, his voice sharp but tinged with fear. "You saw what happened to Martin, to the dog, to the crops. Nothing we offer will satisfy it." That night, the church bell rang out at midnight, a somber echo that rippled through the silent streets. The villagers gathered in the square, clutching candles and murmuring prayers. Eliza, her hands trembling, stepped forward. "We have to do something," she pleaded. "If we wait any longer, none of us will be safe." By the end of the week, the villagers knew there was no escape. Old Rue's shadow was not just a curse, it was a predator, feeding on their fear and despair. And as the nights grew longer, they realized it wasn't just the crops the shadow wanted, it was them. The next morning, the scarecrow's shadow stretched farther than ever, its dark tendrils reaching the outskirts of the village. Rumors spread that the shadow had claimed another victim, the blacksmith's dog, found lifeless near the fields, its body cold and brittle as if drained of life. The contents rotted before her eyes, the fruit collapsing into blackened mush, the bread turning to ash. A deep guttural sound echoed through the streets, a sound that might have been laughter. It was a feeble gesture, but it was all they could muster. That night, Clara woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window. Peering through the glass, she froze. The shadow was there again, sliding across the cobblestones like a snake, its inky tendrils reaching toward the village square. She watched in terror as it encircled the offering basket. "We must make an offering," said Eliza, the innkeeper's wife, her eyes wide with fear. "The fields won't recover unless we appease the spirit." The villagers argued late into the night, their voices rising with desperation. In the end, they decided to leave an offering at the base of the scarecrow, a basket of bread, fruit, and a bottle of mead. She screamed and ran back to the village, tears streaming down her face. The elders convened that evening in the chapel, their voices trembling as they recounted the curse of the scarecrow. "It's restless," old Mr. Dorian muttered, his hands shaking. "The boy disturbed it, and now it hungers." She had been helping her mother gather firewood near the edge of the fields when she felt it, a cold, crawling sensation up her spine. Turning, she saw old Rue standing as always, but its shadow writhed like a living thing, slithering along the rows of corn toward her. The crops, once lush and golden, now bore a strange, sickly hue. No one dared approach the scarecrow, not even to harvest the remaining grain. A week after Martin's disappearance, young Clara, the baker's daughter, claimed she saw the shadow move on its own. In the days that followed, Evermere grew quieter still. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their gazes shifting nervously to the fields as the shadow of old Rue seemed to grow longer with each passing day. The villagers found Martin's home empty the next morning. The scarecrow stood tall once more in the fields, its burlap face freshly stitched. Its shadow stretched long and ominous in the morning sun, almost as if it was smiling. The air turned icy, and Martin saw it. old Roo, standing at the foot of his bed, its crooked grin now wide and gleaming. The Scarecrow's shadow swirled around him, and its stitched eyes seemed to burn with malevolent glee. Words he couldn't understand filled his mind, and the shadow slithered closer. Panic set in. Martin tried to leave the village, but the roads out of Evermere seemed to loop endlessly, bringing him back to the fields. On the third night, the whispers turned to wails. The shadow crept into his home, filling the corners of his room with an unnatural darkness. The next morning, Martin found the crops in the fields blackened and withered, as if scorched by some unseen fire. The villagers glared at him, muttering curses under their breath. That night, the rustling returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from all around him. He woke to a sound, a soft rustling noise, like dry leaves scraping against wood. Sitting up, he peered out the window. At first he saw nothing, then his breath hitched. The shadow was there, stretched across the fields, long and twisting. It moved against the moonlight, flowing like liquid ink, creeping closer to the village. The village of Black Hollow sat nestled in a valley surrounded by golden fields of wheat. Life there was simple, early mornings, hard work, and quiet evenings. But even in its peace, an ancient unease lingered in the northern fields where the Scarecrow stood. It wasn't like the other scarecrows dotting the farmland. This one had a gnarled pumpkin for a head, its carved mouth twisted into a grin that seemed alive. Its straw-stuffed body was draped in tattered clothes, and its hollow eyes stared unseeing at the horizon. But its shadow, that was what kept the villagers away. Each evening at dusk, the Scarecrow's shadow stretched unnaturally far, spilling across the fields and creeping towards the village. Rumors swirled about its origins. Some said a witch had cursed it centuries ago to protect her crops. Thomas was new to Black Hollow, a young farmhand with more bravado than sense. He had heard the tales of the Scarecrow, but he laughed them off as superstitions. The villagers were reluctant, but desperation drove them to action. Armed with torches and tools, they ventured into the northern fields under the cover of night. The Scarecrow loomed ahead, its shadow towering over the group. The air grew colder as they approached, and the whispers grew louder, hissing warnings that made their blood run cold. Margaret began chanting from an ancient text, her words steady despite the fear in her eyes. The ground beneath the Scarecrow began to quake, and a crack split the earth at its base. Within the fissure lay an ornate box carved with strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. The shadow recoiled, writhing as if in pain. "Destroy it!" Margaret cried. One of the villagers reached for the box, but the shadow lashed out, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the night before abruptly falling silent. Margaret grabbed the box, her hands trembling as she hurled it into the flames of a torch. The box ignited with a blinding flash of light, and the Scarecrow let out an unearthly screech. Its body burst into flames, collapsing into a pile of ash as the shadow dissolved into the night. Margaret warned the villagers never to forget the Scarecrow's curse. Every year, they gathered to tell the tale, their voices trembling as they recounted the horrors of the shadow. But the curse was not entirely gone. Deep in the woods beyond the fields, the earth grew cold, and the trees stood lifeless. A single black feather lay undisturbed among the roots, its edges shimmering with an unnatural darkness. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was high, the villagers swore they could hear faint whispers on the wind, carrying a single chilling promise: "I will return." Months after the Scarecrow's destruction, a traveling merchant passing through Black Hollow claimed to have seen the shadow. He told tales of a figure, tall and twisted, moving through the forest to the north. The villagers dismissed his words, eager to believe the nightmare was over, but Margaret knew better. She delved deeper into the old texts, searching for clues about the witch who had cursed the Scarecrow. What she found chilled her to the bone. The witch's mark was only part of the curse. The Scarecrow's true power came from the land itself, corrupted and alive. Destroying the mark had merely sent the shadow into hiding. One night, Margaret woke to a tapping at her window. Pulling back the curtain, she froze. A tall, dark figure stood in her garden, its outline faint but unmistakable. Its head, though no longer a pumpkin, glowed faintly with a sickly light. Before she could scream, it vanished, leaving only the faint scent of burning straw. Margaret gathered the villagers the next morning, her voice grave. "The curse isn't broken," she warned. "The shadow is still out there, waiting for its chance to return." The villagers fortified their homes and avoided the northern fields, but unease hung heavy in the air. Children spoke of strange figures in their dreams, and farmers swore they saw the wheat moving in the dead of night, though there was no wind. Margaret's warning haunted the villagers, but her words soon became a distant echo as the months wore on. However, for young Abigail, a farmer's daughter, the fear was very real. Each night she would hear faint scratching at her bedroom window. Too afraid to look, she hid under her blanket, clutching a wooden cross her mother had given her. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Abigail peered through the glass. Her scream pierced the still air of Black Hollow. Standing in the fields was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its glowing eyes fixed on her. The villagers rushed to her home, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. Only the faint scent of burnt straw lingered. They found no footprints, only patches of withered grass leading back to the northern fields. Margaret, desperate for answers, ventured into the woods beyond the barren fields. The deeper she went, the more unnatural the forest became. Trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark oozing black sap. The air was thick, oppressive, and alive with the sound of whispers. Margaret, desperate for answers, ventured into the woods beyond the barren fields. The deeper she went, the more unnatural the forest became. Trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark oozing black sap. The air was thick, oppressive, and alive with the sound of whispers. The villagers rushed to her home, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. Only the faint scent of burnt straw lingered. They found no footprints, only patches of withered grass leading back to the northern fields. Margaret, desperate for answers, ventured into the woods beyond the barren fields. The deeper she went, the more unnatural the forest became. Trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark oozing black sap. The air was thick, oppressive, and alive with the sound of whispers. In the center of the woods, she found it, a new scarecrow, larger and more menacing than the last. Its body was made of tangled roots and bones, its head a hollow skull emitting an eerie green light. Around its feet, the ground was scorched, and strange symbols were carved into the earth. Margaret fled back to the village, but she knew the truth. This new scarecrow was a herald of something far worse. The villagers gathered once more, this time armed with everything they could muster: axes, torches, and prayers. They marched into the forest under a blood-red moon, determined to end the curse once and for all. As they approached the scarecrow, the air grew colder, and the shadows around them came alive. Dark figures emerged from the trees, their hollow eyes glowing, their movements jerky and unnatural. The villagers fought bravely, their torches illuminating the nightmare, but the darkness was relentless. Margaret, clutching the ancient text, began chanting once more. This time, her voice was filled with defiance. The scarecrow writhed as the symbols around it began to glow. With a deafening roar, the ground split open, swallowing the monstrous figure and the dark forces surrounding it. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the villagers emerged, battered but alive. The forest was silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Black Hollow was finally lifted. Though the scarecrow was gone, the village would never be the same. The northern fields remained barren, and the forest was avoided by all. Margaret, now frail, warned that the curse could return if the land was not respected. Years later, a young boy playing near the edge of the forest found a small charred pumpkin with faint carvings on its surface. As he picked it up, a cold wind swept through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of burning straw. The Shadow's legacy was far from over. Now here the first story has been completed, and now we are going to start the second story, which will be liked by your guys a lot. The village of Evermere was quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in hues of amber and crimson. At the heart of the largest cornfield stood the scarecrow, its straw-stuffed body slumped over a wooden cross. The villagers called it Old Rue, though no one knew why. It had been there longer than anyone could remember, its wide-brimmed hat torn and tilted, its burlap face stitched into an eternal, crooked grin. What truly unnerved the villagers was its shadow, long and sinuous, stretching far beyond what seemed natural, especially at dusk. Whispers passed from lips to ears about the scarecrow's origins. They spoke of a witch who had cursed the land centuries ago, binding her malevolent spirit to the figure. The scarecrow guards the crops, the elders would warn. Disturb it, and you'll pay the price. But in modern times, such tales were dismissed as superstition, and no one was more skeptical than Martin, a young farmhand who had recently moved to the village. It's just a pile of sticks and straw, Martin scoffed one evening at the pub. The villagers fell silent, their eyes wide with alarm. You're all afraid of a story. I'll prove it to you. Tomorrow, Old Rue is coming down. Despite the protests and pleas, Martin marched into the fields the next day armed with an axe. The the Scarecrow loomed ahead, its shadow writhing unnaturally in the midday sun. Martin hesitated for a moment, an inexplicable chill creeping up his spine. Then he shook it off and swung the axe. The first strike severed the wooden post, and the Scarecrow slumped to the ground in a heap. That night, the village was cloaked in an oppressive silence. The air felt heavier, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on Evermore. Martin slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images of the Scarecrow's grinning face and its shadow snaking through the fields.